Just saying earlier, I think I get the award for the longest title at the conference. We'll see what it means anything or not. I'm just going to go through a little bit of background on myself. There's some interesting pictures. These always demonstrate different things to me all the time. 17 to now, and my current joke is that all I see is hair loss over that period of time. But hopefully I've gained some experience. I take that experience into my teaching, and of course this is the studio that I work in. And I also take that same experience into my research, and this is really what I do in terms of where my research area is. And I work with this particular model. In fact, this is one of my postgrads who came up with this reconceptualisation of this systems model of reactivity, which is this thing. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi came up with this particular model. He's done quite a significant number of things. You might notice he's written the foreword for this book, by the way. My work is kind of centred here. And one of the things that I think I'm noted for, I've just come back from the Creativity Conference in Oregon, is amalgamating that with Pierre Bourdieu's work. And he would probably fall over out of his grave, actually, if you saw a diagram like that. And I've reduced some of the ideas of capital back into graphs as well. So that's the background to what it is that I do. And here's a series of books. This is the latest one. There's a fourth one missing from this one, but this sets out theoretical ideas. This gives the empirical application of it, and this is how you apply it in a higher education setting, which is this current book. So I kind of work in projects and in series. Actually this Susan here has come up with that reconceptualised model. These are some of my postgrads, only some of them. This latest paper is also part of a series, and I was really interested in, I was teaching research methods across to a series of designers, communication students, media students, IT students, and also that class had masters and PhD students in it as well. So I had a wide variety of methodologies I had to cover. So I thought to myself, well, I'll take one object and I will apply three different methodological frameworks from different ontological positions, and then see whether I can actually get something common out of those things. So I've actually been through that process already. And the object that I was looking at is mastering. And what I was really interested in terms of mastering, at least from my point of view, is literally this, the combination of this artistic and technical, which for me results in a whole series of creative processes. So this really historically is a process that's kind of seen as primarily technical, primarily a service role, which Phillip was actually talking about as well. And now we're getting increasing recognition, of course, that engineers are contributing very much so to the creative process. So that's what I was really interested in. That'll come back again, I'm sure. The three papers that have been I've presented and published so far, this one I did last year in Stockholm, but I've done an ethnography with a psychologist. The reason the psychologist is on there was because we did this experiment together, and I was relying on him to give me all of the statistical information and the processes of running that, because I'm primarily an ethnographer myself, that's where I live. This practice-based paper, which I presented last year, I've had a number of postgrads who are actually working in a practice-based area, so I wanted to actually, I thought it was unfair of me to be supervising people where I didn't understand what processes they were going through themselves, certainly at the methodological level. So the paper I'm presenting today is this fourth one, and that's the end of the series for me. In this particular project anyway, is how do I get these three seemingly disparate methodologies and worldviews in many ways to actually live together. And some of this you may be aware of. So I'll start with the experiment. Same sort of things, with stimulus response model. We wanted to compare unmastered to mastered recordings, which we were lucky enough to get a hold of. We took out the volume out of the stimuli and played these to a number of participants. We're looking for particular emotional reactions from them across a range of scales and so on. And lo and behold, of course, what comes out of this is that mastering makes a difference. Even if you take the volume increases out of this process, mastering does make a difference to the way that people receive what's going on at a psychological and physiological level. So, across all three emotion scales, participants consistently rated mastered music pieces differently to unmastered music pieces, indicating that the mastering process was able to produce a notable and consistent change in emotion ratings, which this was critical. If if we are going to indicate that mastering engineers are creative, we want to have some difference in this process here. In fact, one of the things I tell all my students, whether they're working in media or music, whatever, the fundamental job as communicators is to shift whoever's engaging with your work from that emotional state to that emotional state. And I think that's what we've really got to go and develop with, particularly with students. So yes, we can measure that. And we certainly did with particular mastering pieces. I've continued to work as a producer engineer and many other things as well. In fact, I've got 2 projects out this year, apart from this book. And I've been working with this guy, Don Bartley, for quite some time, both on my own projects, but also in terms of this ethnographic process. One of the other things I did as well was as a music journalist for quite a while, and I managed to get a story on Don as well. It was interesting, and when I was doing some live work, to have the bass player in the band that I was mixing start to tell me about mastering because he'd read about it in this music magazine. Of course, I'd written the piece, so it was just a really circular piece of information coming back at me. But Don's worked with a lot of different people. This is an old, when he was in 301 in Castlereagh Street in Sydney, he's gone up to the Blue Mountains with a company, his own company called Benchmark Mastering at the moment. But this is a EMI Abbey Road desk that he's brought out to Sydney. And I'm not sure where that has gone to, and whether Don's taken it once he left EMI and a couple of other people bought the place, whether he's taken it there or not. But this is an interesting setup that he has as well. This reel-to-reel over here, he was getting credits for digital remasters through the late 80s and 90s and so on. And he was running just about everything back through this tape machine, which is on a constant loop, just to bring some of that analog material back into those recordings as well. So I'm learning about mastering in this whole process, not just identifying whether mastering is any good or not, but I'm actually learning, this is the 10,000 hours you're talking about. I'm learning something about mastering because to me it's the weakest part of what it is that I do. I didn't have a great understanding of it, probably still don't, which is the 3rd paper, really, will demonstrate that. So I spent a lot of time with Don in the studio, talking, interviewing, having a look at his gear and so on, etc. So the conclusion out of that paper, of course, is that mastering engineers are a significant part of, at least for me, the system of record production. They're necessary, of course, but they're not sufficient to actually produce a particular emotional response in whatever that record is attempting to do. One of the things that I stumbled across through Don, of course, is a piece of software like this, Renovator. I was doing a 11-part documentary series for the ABC on the wine industry. And I did all the field recording, I did compose the music, put it all together and so on. I did all the edits and mixes for it as well. And there was one particular little scene in that where there was a bus. We recorded the audio right in the middle of Sydney and Phillip Street, right next to a particular museum, but there was a bus that come along and it braked at that particular point, and I wanted to keep the audio. There was this massive squeal on the audio at that particular point, and I just couldn't get rid of it until Don said, well, let's try this, and he just simply isolated the frequency and just simply wrote it out. And it was amazing to me what was possible, and this was kind of early on in my process as well. So of course, being young and foolish, I thought, well, it's just all in the software. I can buy myself Wavelab and I can go ahead and I can learn how to be a mastering engineer, which I then proceeded to do over a number of years, attempting to take my own material and that I was producing, both writing and so on for myself, and attempting to sound as good as Don Bartley. Lo and behold, of course, everybody knows the conclusion to that. But I was learning things as I was going and taking it back into my teaching in the process. And it's a pretty clunky little program, but nonetheless it was doing all sorts of interesting things for me. So there was a transition in this learning process out of the ethnography and stepping into practice-based research, which I think is fairly close methodologically to ethnography anyway. The other thing that occurred during this period, I was keeping journals on what I was learning, by the way, so it's also contributed to the whole process, is the question of hypercompression. I took on a postgrad student who came in from industry. You may know Rob Taylor, who did Whitlam's and quite a few other people as well. So he's just completed, in fact he's just been, I think in a week and a half time we had graduation, so a little ritual to go through with Rob as well. But his whole thesis was literally on that process, hypercompression in mastering, and he travelled around the world and he talked to just about every significant mastering engineer that he could find, There's about 130 of them, and you know, he learned a lot himself out of that process. But he already was far more advanced than what I was. But I learned a hell of a lot out of just simply supervising that particular doctoral thesis, which I then wrote about as part of the practice-based research and so on. What were we going to say here? Oh, yes. Out of that practice, and this is quite obvious, I think, as a lot of research winds up being. Firstly, I now know what to listen for and how to manipulate the tools well enough. That's a really important phrase. I can get away with what I need to get away with. Secondly, it would take a lifetime to learn about the subtleties and nuances of mastering. That's a no-brainer. I think I would have known that right from the start without having to go through this whole process. And the third thing, which I think is most important, is that while there's a DIY approach is often born of necessity, and it's really about the finance more than anything else. I've literally got to do this myself. I've got to learn how to do it myself because I cannot afford these other processes as well. But that's critical. Specialisation is still, I think, is still important, despite all the digital tools available to us. A much needed and critical facet of the recording industry is that question of specialisation, because it's not just the tools. It's the, literally, as you were saying, Tim, it's the experience that you bring to this whole process. So the time and how best to use it is still central to all creative activity. If I concentrate on this thing over here, 24 hours, then I can only do this. You have 24 hours in a day, and you have a significant lifetime to get myself through. And for me, of course, the system indicates that each agent in the field, whether it's a mastering engineer, whether it's a record engineer, whether it's tracking or whatever, has something important to contribute to the making of a finished recorded product. So all of us, in some ways, are involved in changing that emotional state. Now, what does that actually mean? A little metaphor, which is not mine actually, and I use this in class as well. I think each one of these methodologies has something to teach us. And the metaphor here, of course, is in terms of boxing. I can stand outside a boxing ring and I can count the number of cars in the car park. I can even measure the height of the stadium, the number of people that go in. I can count all of those things. And that will tell me something about boxing. I can go into the ring itself. I can sit by the side of, this is called the ring, of course. And I can talk to the people that are inside the ring, I can talk to people that are sitting beside me at length or whatever, and I can gain some knowledge about what it is that I'm actually intrigued by, or I can become a boxer. So I can do all of these things, but there are limitations to every one of them. And I think it's in combination that we get a fairly comprehensive, not a full picture, but a fairly comprehensive picture of what's going on. Which gets me to this thing. It's not the methodologies, I think, or the ontologies that we engage with, or where our knowledge comes from and so on, that gives us a commonality. I think there's something much larger, at a much larger scale that does this, and you've probably come across this as well. But this comes from a book by Jonathan Griggs called The Foundations of Research, and it's just simply linking questions of ontology, epistemology, methodology, methods, and of course sources. What does this word mean? It's just a very complex Greek adaptation of ontos, real, and the study of the real. You can just boil it down to what we believe is real. What's our understanding of what reality is? Is this thing actually here, or does it disappear when I'm not engaged with it? Is it an objective place we're interested in? Is it a subjective place we're interested in? Or somewhere in between? And of course that governs in many ways the knowledge that we actually engage with, the things that we choose to learn about, things that we choose to research and so on, and that comes down to the practicalities of the methodologies that we engage with. And then of course the methods themselves. What are the things that we do in practice that's related to our belief systems about the world? I purposefully use the word belief system there. And of course that also relates to the data that we can go and collect. I don't think Griggs is actually entirely correct in this graph here, by the way, because I think these arrows run that way as well. So it's not just a question of ontology governing what we do in practice, and practice actually governs what we do in terms of the beliefs that we hold about the nature of the world itself. He's not the only one. Here's a different way to say much the same sort of thing. This comes from Michael Crotty, and this is literally about social research. He's saying the same thing. He makes an argument to say you cannot separate ontology and epistemology out. Those two things are intimately related. The body of knowledge that you have must contribute to what you believe the world to be in terms of the reality of the world, and of course the other way around as well. He adds in a theoretical perspective, and I think that's actually related. This is just a sub part of what this particular thing is as well.
I'll give you a practical example in a second. And the methodology that you choose is related to all these things, and of course the method as well. So you can also put it in text-based form, which he does do as well. You can work over here. For instance, you can be a discipline observer if you're an ethnographer. And of course, if you're an ethnographer, you're unlikely to hold a positive theoretical position. It may be a little bit further down, it may be something like this or whatever. Remember, this is social research, so these are social science constructs. And he says there's a very limited set of ontologies available to you. Most of us can only think of two, objectivism and subjectivism. But I would put this one in the centre. Why? Because I think this is where I exist. I'd be very careful with this word because it's been used a number of different ways, across education and across all other forms as well. Just put it very simply, the world is out there for me to observe and interact with, as separate to me. In other words, it's an object that I can deal with. This one, of course, is that the world only comes into existence because I'm engaging with the world. I much prefer this one. This is where I live. In fact, I think I would be quite mad if I lived across all three, but I'll demonstrate in a second to you why this one works for me across those three forms. Is that I believe that there is a world that is objectively out there, but I can only know it, and this word has come up quite a lot at this conference, through the mediations of those things that I engage with, which is the central position for me between these two. So, we can also put it, we can also put it in terms of a couple of sentences. Ontology relates to how we understand the nature of reality, and epistemology refers to a theory of knowledge. It's related to ontology in that the nature of reality you set out to explore influences the sort of knowledge that you can have of it, and methodological implications, of course, follow from that. Observation, measurement, and interpretation depend on the understanding of the ontological and epistemological nature of the work at hand, which is why I think the arrows run both ways. And the interesting thing for me, which is when I get to the last part of the title of my piece, is that I think this is what we can have in common. We all do this, whether we are engaged in experimental work, whether we're engaged in ethnographic work, whether we're engaged in bringing design thinking into production work and so on. We've all got this in common, and I think this is the commonality that we're dealing with. And for me, each one of those three forms of experiment can only exist for me as myself as a researcher if I take a constructionist position. I can't be both objective and subjective at the same time, although that's a reasonable definition of constructionism. That will do. That will be me. Thank you very much. This is where I live, by the way.
Wow. Can we come and visit?
You can, because my house is just up there.
Oh.
Thanks, Phil. Any questions?
I'll kick off. Phil, I'm sure you've got something to say about the sort of the level wars that mastering has imposed on popular culture.
Yes.
And it's quite a thing, isn't it? Because if your song comes up on a shuffle next to Drake's, it must be just as loud.
Yeah.
So I guess there's kind of two audiences there's sort of shuffle culture or getting on the radio, and then there's the audiophile listening to the beauty and clarity and the dynamics in the music. Have you noticed this kind of this conjecture in popular culture and
I've noticed in a lot of detail because I've had to read Rob Taylor's thesis many times, and that's kind of at the heart of what he was talking about. And there's a third group there that's really interested in those wars, and that's engineers themselves. And in fact, most of what's come out of the interviews is that we're doing this because we won't get the work unless we do.
Yeah.
And it becomes a self-perpetuating thing. Everybody's engaging in it, so therefore I've got to engage in it. And nobody wants to, in the Mexican standoff, wants to put the tool down.
Yeah.
Why? Because you don't get the work otherwise. But yes, you can read about it in depth in Rob Taylor's thesis, which I'm sure that he'll publish shortly.
Again, another question about mastering. Joe Bennett posted a Guardian article the other day on Facebook that was quite interesting about the basis of it was that the canon of music is dying because of streaming, and that the album is, it's died as well because of streaming. Where do you see mastering? Well, the interesting thing I think is your research has been going for 10 years.
Yep.
And in a lot of ways I think mastering has changed quite a bit in that time. And now that the album is coming out of that picture, which in Bob Katz's citation you'd mentioned the albums and album ordering being part of the art of mastering. Where do you see that within?
Okay, well, you're asking me questions that are probably more readily directed at Rob's work again.
Yeah.
Okay, but there's a set of European standards that are being introduced, not just for television, but also for streaming services. They haven't quite got through yet, that are attempting to deal with that process. And he was arguing that it's likely with those streaming services that the loudness wars, which is the technical term of it, the loudness wars will disappear because we'll have no need for it anymore, because you're not actually comparing one piece to another because they'll all be normalised.
I still debate that actually.
Yeah,
well, I think it's a lot about consumption.
Yeah, well, a lot of people are still debating it. In fact, I think he's made himself, with one group of people, relatively unpopular at AES. So, but they've asked him to talk a number of times there about that particular process. But as far as getting rid of it, I don't think we've seen the end of it yet. If that's the core of what you're asking.
Oh, kind of. It's just more interesting how your research has taken a while and you've taken a lot of different aspects of the same situation, but then even the whole basis of it is mastering, and I feel like that's kind of changed as well in a month or more, which I guess is...
Well, to get a little philosophical about it, I think all of our objects of research are changing all the time. Kirsten's description of vocal clarity and everything else that surrounds it, you just take one thing out of time and you kind of look at that in as much detail as you can, but you've really got to recognise that the world is in a complete state of flux and dynamic all the time. And my assistant's work is telling me that. So yeah.
Aristotelian type.
Yeah.
Dynamic.
Yeah, it's moving.
Yeah.
And that's part of the positivist exercise is to sit it still, but it's not still.
Could you just comment on traditionally the mastering engineer wasn't seen as part of the creative process. They were the start of the manufacturing process, so culturally they've moved. And the one thing the millennial kids I was talking about, where they will bring an external person in, is mastering, which originally nobody cared about because once it left the producer's hands, mastering was part of the manufacturing process. Could you maybe just comment on that?
Well, only just to reiterate what you're saying, it was part of the manufacturing process, and mastering was kind of really about when you would stamp something, and you wanted to make sure that this thing was this object that you were putting out into the world actually worked in a mechanical way. So that's where it starts from. But then after a while, someone recognises that this is actually changing the nature. Suddenly that the bass isn't what it sounded like in the studio when we're mixing. So let's go up to the mastering engineer and see what they're doing. As human beings do, we focus and we focus and we focus, and out of it comes some really interesting aesthetic things. And I think my understanding of that process historically is the change that occurred with particularly Jeff Emmerich and his concerns with what was going on. That also tells you something about the creative process as well. It's not an absolute. We're dealing with relativities a lot of the time. People, record producers, same period. When was the first time you saw a credit on an album for a record producer?
Absolutely,
it comes in at a certain period and then it moves on.
Yeah.
So discursive structures.
Just following on from your point, is mastering perhaps just a way of saying, if I hand over money and give it to somebody to finish, then I can stop?
Yeah.
Please get us mastered.
And I don't want to pay for it twice, so...
Yeah. Interesting.
Just following on from that, so you wrote a lot about the collaborative nature of music production, but it strikes me mastering is the last bastion where you send it to someone and they do it on their own. You don't tend to attend a master. I mean, I have the records, but you sit in the back and say nothing. It's not collaborative in that sense. So do you think that's going to change, or if it's not, why not?
It seems that, I can only speak from my own experience here. When I was first working with Don, I would go down to 301 and I'd sit in the back of the room, and occasionally I'd move up the front where his monitors were, and there'd be an exchange back and forth. It was a great coffee shop down the street, good cakes, everything, so that seat was really cherished. But there was a back and forth going I don't actually, I'm not in Don's physical presence anymore. Most of what I'm dealing with at benchmark mastering is just straight down the pipe, and he's sending stuff back. I'm making comments that's going. So there is some sort of collaboration going on. It's just virtual, more than anything, I think. And you'd have the same experience, I mean.
Yeah, I found with Don it was best not discussing things. I've suggested a few things.
Yes.
I used to hate the monitors he had in that room, so I was getting
I think you could see that.
well, that sounded horrible. I'd be like, I'll turn up the bass, and then I'd get home to the master. It'd be horrible.
Yeah.
Just like, oh.
Just let him do his thing.
Yeah,
That's most often what happens.
But you still used to attend all the time.
Yeah.
I was just going to make the point that I think one of the other problems we contend with now as producers, and for me as a mix engineer, is handing over stems to mastering engineers. Now, it's actually in my contracts that I have to, I hate it, but I hand over stems, which to me is an extension of what I do as a mix engineer.
Yeah. The things that a mastering engineer can do with a stem is just remix, basically.
Also, I suppose the question for you is, where does that fit into the kind of, the sort of, I suppose the idea of agency versus intention here between mix engineer, mastering engineer, even with artists as well. It seems like a lot of people, it's giving over a lot of power, where I finish a mix and I think, okay, yeah, maybe it needs brightening, it needs making it louder. But it can come back and it sounds like a totally different mix.
Yeah, it can. It can, absolutely. This model here accounts for all of that as well. We tend to think that this is a single individual, and this is what I like about this reconceptualisation. This has been renamed agent. So the person who's making decisions may not be a person, it may be a dyad, it may be a group of people, it may even be institutional. But we are always engaged in some relationship with everyone else in the field, those people who can make some sort of decision, whether it's a minor or it's major, with a body of knowledge, a single system, a set of codes or whatever. And it's the relationship between those three things that this comes out of. So I don't think you're going to actually avoid the input of everyone else. But some people have more power than others do. In fact, Anthony Giddens talks about the transformative capacity of power being fairly central to the whole process. That there are some people who can get other people to do things for them. And in that process, the whole work transforms as well. And that is, and if you understand Giddens' work, that is a really ugly word called structuration, where he attempts to put agency and structure, what you're calling intention, together. Sure. So that those things actually work in that process. But I don't think, at least according to this model and the research I've been doing over the last couple of decades, we tend to think just this. We take all of this out and we tend to think just this. This is what produces what's going on.
I think, just as a follow-up, I think where that becomes a problem is where you have two mix engineers who both mix the same song, and record companies think nothing of saying, well, I'll just have the drum and bass stem from that one, and they don't even credit this mix engineer.
Yes.
So it becomes the work of somebody else, even though, and I know that happened in the case of Dido, actually. So a good friend of mine mixed records, and somebody else just did the polishing, and they got the credit, and actually he could hear it was all of his, and it went to court.
Yeah, with those power relationships come hierarchy, and then comes money, and comes all sorts of other things as well. So that kind of feeds into that system as well. Laurie?
Well, thanks for this, Phil. It's really great, and you always think about such a meta level, and I'm glad you came back to this slide, because one of the things that I kept thinking about as you were talking, I'm not a producer, I'm not a masterer or a mixer, I'm an analyst, right? I'm on the receiving end, because I'm a theoretical
you live in here
musicologist.
You're part of it.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering, like, where, okay, so maybe that begins to answer my question. Where do the analysts, the critical listeners, the interpreters, the cultural interlocutors, where do we fit on that map?
Anyone who has a degree of knowledge of this simple system constitutes part of this, and this is constituted by knowledge of that simple system. So that's a question of a degree of power in this relationship. How much does an audience affect what's going on in the studio as opposed to what the decisions the record maker is making? And of course, the audience is always there. The audience is always in the back of your head. You're always thinking, what does this sound like? And you're, as a producer, you're moving between, in fact, it's part of your job, you're moving between, say, the technical part, the aesthetic part, but also representing those people who are going to listen to this work.
it's interesting because I like to play with the tools, right? So the reason I love this conference is that I like to see how the producers and the mixers are working with the tools, and I try to use those tools. Like I work with WaveLab, but never to actually yield anything, only ever to interpret, right? So how does it look? You know, what do I see with these tools, right? And so I'm always interested in how could we work more with these tools to make them more valuable to people like me. You know, like I work with Isotope, but I work with it just so that I can extract my 3D because I love it. You know, I have to see that and I want to work with that. But I never will use Isotope as a creator, right? But I'm grateful to Isotope for starting to build these tools that can be on the reception end, right? I don't have to be putting into it, I can be taking out, right?
Well, there's two comments, I think. I think that, you know, as a critical person, as an analyst, etc., the more that you know about what's going on, I think the much better your critiques will be. And I think the second thing, which is a really big meta level, is that it's really hard to, and I don't think this is just a common or a recent development with prosumers and producers and all those sort of terms. I think we've always been producer, consumer at the same time. I think those two things are absolutely interlocked together. In fact, you'll see me do this in my classes a lot. I do this. It's not because it's a hip-hop thing or anything. I'm constantly trying to connect things together. And it's what systems do. So I don't think reception is separate from production. I think production and reception are absolutely entwined. There's a thought for you?
In the ideal world.
In the ideal world, yes.
That Shannon Weaver model.
That's exactly
if you do the Shannon Weaver model, the more advanced version is the feedback loop built in between sending and relieving the original Stuart Hall version.
And then you've got to get way past that.
Yeah.
The University of Huddersfield, inspiring tomorrow's professionals.